Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to rise today to discuss the motion regarding the ballooning costs of the ArriveCAN app. And in a time right now when too many Canadians are struggling just to make ends meet, it's critical that the government ensure that we have sound stewardship of tax dollars. And I share the concerns of Canadians and frontline CBSA officers that the ArriveCAN app has cost way too much and delivered too little. Now, Madam Speaker, last week at the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, we heard from the National President of the Customs and Immigration Union that frontline service workers were never consulted, not once, Madam Speaker, on the development of the app or any of the more than 70 updates that were required. Now, while the government continued to pour money into ArriveCAN, frontline workers were forced to deal with the fallout of a glitchy app on top of a severe staffing shortage, Madam Speaker. And this has had a huge demoralizing impact on the mental health and the morale of CBSA workers and officers. And now at the committee, I supported a study to provide more transparency to Canadians, which they deserve, about the costs associated with the ArriveCAN app. But I also pushed the committee to go farther. I believe the ArriveCAN debacle is just part of a larger systemic issue of the government increasingly hiring expensive consultants who hire expensive consultants with no regard for delivering the best value for Canadians. That's why I tabled a motion that was supported unanimously at OGO to request that the Auditor General conduct a performance audit on outsourcing policies and practices more broadly. Now, earlier this year, the Globe and Mail reported that since the 2015-2016 fiscal year, government spending on outsourced contracts, Madam Speaker, has increased by 41.8% under the federal Liberals, reaching $11.8 billion in the 2020-2021 fiscal year alone. Now, this trend was started under the previous Conservative government and continues to cost Canadians today. All too often, outsourced contracts seem to balloon and cost more if public service workers were tasked with the same work. And that's more than if they were public service workers were tasked with the work. The Treasury Board has provided guidance on preparing estimates to help departments with make or buy decisions, as well as policies on the planning and management of investments that require departments decisions that demonstrate best value and sound stewardship. However, Madam Speaker, it's not clear how these policies are applied in practice or what oversight is actually involved. So I believe a broader performance audit by the Auditor General, as I proposed and was supported at the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, could provide important insights to parliamentarians on questions like how often are departments' cost estimates exceeded by outsourced work? What happens when a department gets an estimate wrong? How are lessons learned and shared across departments? And I want to highlight today the concerning transparency and accountability issues that arise in relation to outsourced contracts. Now, the Public Service Alliance of Canada recently told the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates that, quote, the procurement process for contracting out work promotes corporate secrecy at the expense of Canadians' right to know how funds are spent and how services are managed, end quote. Our access to information regime, Madam Speaker, is broken, and it is extremely difficult for Canadians to get a full picture of how funds directed to the private sector are being spent. This is a perfect example of that, Madam Speaker, what we're talking about today. Now, it is also extremely difficult for public service workers who become aware of mismanagement related to outsourced contracts to raise the alarm without fear of reprisal. Canada's whistleblower protection regime has been called amongst one of the worst in the world, Madam Speaker. And cases like the Phoenix pay disaster and the ArriveCAN app show how there are real costs to the Canadian public when public service workers can't speak up. The blame for Canada's ineffective whistleblower protection regime lies with both the Conservatives and Liberal parties. And David Hutton, a whistleblower protection expert and senior fellow at the Centre for Free Expression at Toronto Metropolitan University, recently wrote in the Hill Times that when the member for Carleton, then minister, Madam Speaker, under the Harper government, introduced federal accountability legislation, that in 2006 he claimed repeatedly that it would offer ironclad protection and indeed it does, but for the wrongdoers, not for the whistleblowers or the public, end quote. So since the Liberals came into power, they failed to remedy this situation. Instead, have sat on a unanimous report from the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates for over 5 years, Madam Speaker. Now, that report recommended sweeping legislative reforms to Canada's whistleblower protection law. And as the Liberal government bounces from scandal to scandal, they seem to have no interest in improving protections for whistleblowers who could shine a light on government wrongdoing or mismanagement of public funds. This is critical, Madam Speaker, to the transparency that we're calling for, and for so that Canadians can trust their government. Now, in addition to transparency and accountability issues that I'm talking about, the government's increasing reliance on outsourcing raises concerning equity issues that warrant discussion. In 2018, the UN Special Rapporteur on Poverty and Human Rights discussed privatization as a cause of poverty, while still costing governments more. In 2019, the Standing Committee on Human Resources tabled a report on precarious work, recommending the government, quote, review human resources policies and budgeting practices to ensure that they are incentivizing hiring employees on indeterminate contracts, end quote. Like, Madam Speaker, this is critical that the government stop the precarious work and incentivize hiring people full-time, Madam Speaker. Now further, the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada has written about the interplay between outsourcing and gender equity, stating, quote, in IT, lucrative contracts are doled out to a male-dominant industry that has notoriously struggled with gender equity, while at the same time, lower paid and precarious temporary service contracts are disproportionately filled by women. The majority of temporary workers become trapped in a cycle of persistent temporary work, defined by low pay, few if any fringe benefits, and high risk of unemployment and labor force exit, end quote. So while the government will say it's forced to rely on the private sector to deliver IT services because of skill shortages within the public service, it is ignoring in-house talent and failing to invest in further institutional capacity in a way that promotes gender equity. And I will also say failing to work with public institutions, Madam Speaker, to tap into that expertise and knowledge that lies in our public institutions, including higher learning institutions. Now, the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada has filed more than 2,500 grievances where work was outsourced rather than assigned to existing expertise in the public service. And in the last fiscal year, the government spent $2.3 billion on information technology service contracts, compared to $1.85 billion on its own IT workforce. So if this government is truly committed to building a strong and inclusive public service, it is essential that it maintain and build in-house IT capacity. Now, the government's increasing reliance on outsourcing is not only undermining efforts to promote equity, but is also costing Canadians more. And I know, although it's difficult to get information on outsourced contracts, the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada share with me the following alarming examples. Quote, one IT technical architect at National Defence cost taxpayers over $359,000 per year on a contract that was renewed for 8 years, Madam Speaker. The equivalent public servant, including their pension, would have cost $147,876 a year. That's saving over $1.5 million, end quote. And another quote, Madam Speaker, is another example. Shared Services Canada spent over $14 million over the past 5 years on 3 resources and posted a contract tender extension for another 4 years. 3 public servants, including their pension over the same 5 years, would have cost $1.855 million, saving over $12 million. So it's not just in IT that we're seeing these increased costs because of reliance on outsourcing, but also in other areas like cleaning, grounds maintenance, healthcare, and access to information. See, I'm running out of time, Madam Speaker, but I will state, while I agree that Canadians deserve transparency on the ArriveCAN app, they deserve much more. They deserve transparency on the true costs and risks of outsourcing public services. I hope all members will agree that a broader examination of outsourcing by the Auditor General is warranted, and it's in the best interests of Canadians. Thank you.
The honourable member for North Thurlow Peterborough South.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and thank you for the members' discussion. I'm glad to see that they are calling for greater accountability with the ArriveCAN debacle. However, I'm still troubled by the fact that they continue to prop up this Liberal government. Does the member know if the words transparency, accountability, or ethics is in the confidence and supply agreement?
The honourable member for Courtenay-Alberni.
Madam Speaker, we're here every day calling on the government to do the right thing, to provide support to Canadians. What we have is gatekeepers from Conservatives and Liberals protecting big corporations that are having record profits. Every day we're here standing up for Canadians. We're here today calling for transparency when it comes to outsourcing. Both Conservatives and Liberals, they're the champions of outsourcing. It's their friends. Highly paid consultants hiring highly paid consultants. This is just their history, Madam Speaker. It needs to stop now. We're here to fight for people.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader, Senate.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. So I understand that the NDP will be voting in favour of this motion. The first resolve clause in the preamble, or the first whereas clause in the preamble, says that the cost of government is driving up the cost of living. I'm wondering if the member can comment on what costs of government he thinks are driving up the cost of living.
Honourable member for Courtenay-Alberni.
Well, Madam Speaker, I'll just start with the government financing oil and gas. I mean, they make these huge investments in industries that are, that have had $147 billion in profit last year, and here they are subsidizing, building the Trans Mountain Pipeline that's skyrocketing out of control. Outsourcing is built into this whole thing, Madam Speaker, this whole regime of waste of taxpayers' dollars that could all be going to helping Canadians, to helping improve the lives of Canadians so they can get access to medicine, Madam Speaker, housing, the things that they actually need to live.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Longueuil, Saint-Hubert. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his very technical speech. He did his research, and I always appreciate when colleagues provide data that can help us in this debate. Obviously, in the motion before us, it seems somewhat naive. The Conservatives always say if we eliminate the $54 billion in ArriveCAN, it could help Canadian inflation. Well, anyway, there's something in the news today that was interesting. It said we knew this, but Canada is the second biggest investor in fossil fuels of the G20. We're talking about millions a year. And now we're learning that we're missing money for food banks. Thousands of Canadians are reducing the size of their meals, and they're eating less healthy foods because they want to save money. So can we invest that $8.5 billion to help people here in Canada?
For Courtenay-Alberni.
This is the whole story of the whole regime between the Conservatives and Liberals, Madam Speaker. It's about them bailing out their friends, whether it be big oil, big grocery, the big banks. This is what they do. They don't want to go after them and make them pay their fair share. Instead, they leave Canadians hung out to dry. And this outsourcing thing that we're talking about today, Madam Speaker, is again part of their history and their story. It's about their friends, these expensive consultants that hire expensive consultants. Phoenix pay system. The Conservatives started, Madam Speaker, is supposed to save over $80 million a year. It's cost $2.4 billion, Madam Speaker. They're not innocent over here, Madam Speaker, but they carried it on. They kept going with it, the Liberals, Madam Speaker, and it needs to end, and we're going to be here to stop and fight for the Auditor General to come in and look at this, Madam Speaker. It needs to change. We're going to stand up for Canadians and make sure that Canadians get the support that they actually deserve.
The